My husband vanished one Tuesday morning, leaving behind nothing but a hastily scribbled note and $200,000 in hidden debt he'd accumulated for his mistress. He thought I would crumble under the weight of financial ruin, believing I'd spend years digging myself out of the hole he'd created. Instead, I channeled my finance degree and industry expertise that he'd always belittled as just a job into a meteoric career rise that landed me in the most unexpected position, directly above him in the corporate hierarchy. The look on Richard's face when he walked into that boardroom and realized his abandoned wife was now his new boss was worth every sleepless night and every tear I had shed. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning Richard disappeared started like any other Tuesday. September rain tapped against our bedroom window as I reached across the sheets to find his side of the bed empty and cold. Not unusual, he often left early for breakfast meetings at his investment firm. I stretched, mentally cataloging the day ahead. My presentation to senior management at Meridian Financial, the dinner I needed to prepare for Richard's colleagues, the call to the plumber about our perpetually leaking kitchen faucet. In the kitchen, I noticed his travel mug still in the dish rack. Odd, since his morning coffee was as much a ritual as breathing. That's when I saw the note, propped against the fruit bowl, his handwriting hurried and slanting across the page. "Melissa, I can't do this anymore. I've found something real. Don't try to contact me. I'll have my lawyer handle everything. Richard." 17 words to end 15 years of marriage. 17 words that revealed nothing and everything at once. My hands didn't shake. My coffee cup didn't slip from my grasp in some dramatic display of shock. Instead, a curious calm settled over me as I read the note again. Analytical rather than emotional. This reaction would have surprised Richard, who had always characterized me as overly sensitive and emotionally fragile. Descriptions that had never aligned with the woman who'd graduated top of her class with a finance degree, but had somehow, over 15 years of marriage, become the narrative I'd started to believe. I called his office, maintaining the composed voice I used for professional matters. "Richard Maxwell's office," his assistant Diane answered. "Hi, Diane, it's Melissa. Is Richard in today?" A pause. Too long. "He's actually taken a leave of absence. Personal reasons. I thought you would know." "I see. And when did this leave of absence begin?" Another pause. "He submitted the paperwork last week, effective today." Last week, while we were planning our anniversary trip. While he was telling me about the bonus he expected. While he was making love to me on Sunday morning, whispering that I was beautiful. "Thank you, Diane. That's all I needed to know." I hung up before she could offer sympathy I wasn't ready to receive. My next call was to cancel my presentation at Meridian Financial. For the first time in my 10-year career there, I called in sick. Not for heartbreak, but because I suddenly had more urgent matters to investigate. I started with our shared laptop. Richard, overconfident in his technical prowess, had never bothered to clear his browser history or use private browsing. The evidence unfolded with embarrassing ease. Emails to a real estate agent about a beachfront property in San Diego, flight confirmations for two to California departing early that morning, hotel reservations under Richard and Vanessa Maxwell. Vanessa. His 28-year-old assistant from last year who had mysteriously transferred to another department. Richard had called her ambitious but disorganized. Apparently, she had organized her way right into my marriage. Still, none of this explained the uncharacteristic coldness of his departure. Richard, with his carefully cultivated image of the successful, benevolent husband, would typically choreograph a more graceful exit, one that wouldn't tarnish his reputation among our social circle, unless there was something worse he was hiding. With growing suspicion, I logged into our joint bank account. The balance seemed normal, but when I checked the transaction history, I found a series of large withdrawals over the past 6 months, each followed by transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Our investment portfolio, which I had largely helped build with my finance background before Richard insisted on managing it properly himself, showed similar suspicious activity. Stocks sold, funds withdrawn, equity lines maxed out. By noon, my dining room table was covered with printed statements, highlighting in hand, as I pieced together the financial crime scene Richard had left behind. The bottom line emerged with brutal clarity. He had systematically drained our joint, assets and taken out loans in our names totaling just over $200,000. My phone rang. Meridian's HR department calling to check if I needed anything. I almost laughed at the timing. "Actually," I said, "I'm dealing with a personal emergency. I may need a few days." "Of course, Melissa. Your presentation can be rescheduled. Charles mentioned you've been in line for the regional director position. This won't affect that consideration." The regional director position, a role I had been quietly working toward for 3 years. A role that Richard had dismissed as unnecessary. Stress, and probably too demanding whenever I'd mentioned it. A role that, ironically, would have significantly increased our household income had I not been subtly discouraged from pursuing it. "Thank you. I'll be in touch soon." I hung up and stared at the financial disaster spread across my dining room. The same table where Richard had laughed just 2 nights ago, twirling pasta onto his fork while telling me that women like me just aren't naturally good with high-level financial strategy. This despite my degree and decade of experience at one of the top financial firms in the country. The same Richard who had convinced me early in our marriage to let him handle our investments because it's what I do for a living, honey. The same Richard who had insisted I stay in my comfortable but advancement-limited position because it gave me such a nice work-life balance. My phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. He said you knew it was over." The audacity stole my breath. Not only had Richard abandoned me and stolen our financial future, but he had also painted me as the willing participant in our marriage's dissolution. I didn't respond to Vanessa. Instead, I called my bank and credit card companies, freezing joint accounts and reporting potential fraud. I contacted a lawyer recommended by a colleague, scheduling an emergency consultation for that afternoon. I pulled my credit report, documenting every unauthorized account and loan. By evening, when I should have been hosting Richard's colleagues for dinner, I was instead sitting in my lawyer's office, Barbara Kahn's experienced eyes widening as she reviewed the evidence I'd compiled in less than 8 hours. "He's left you with substantial debt," she confirmed, "but you've been remarkably thorough in documenting everything. We can make a case for financial fraud, especially given the timing and his deliberate concealment." "What are my options?" I asked, the analytical calm that had carried me through the day still holding. "We filed for divorce immediately, citing abandonment and financial misconduct. We freeze any remaining assets before he can access them. We dispute the debts he fraudulently acquired, and," she looked at me with unexpected admiration, "we use every bit of financial expertise you clearly possess to rebuild your position." I nodded, a plan already forming. "I need to secure my income first, build a financial fortress he can't touch." Barbara smiled slightly. "I've handled many divorces involving financial deception, Mrs. Maxwell, but I've rarely seen someone respond with such strategic clarity on day 1. "Richard always said I was too emotional," I replied, gathering my documents. "But he never really knew me at all. If he had, he would have realized that betraying a financial analyst with 15 years of pent-up ambition was perhaps the worst investment decision of his career." As I drove home through the September rain, past the life Richard and I had built together, I didn't feel the heartbreak I had expected. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar yet energizing taking its place, a cold, precise determination. The kind that transforms victims into architects of their own resurrection. By midnight, I had drafted a comprehensive action plan. Financial, legal, professional, and personal steps mapped out with the same meticulous attention I'd once given to managing our household while Richard pursued his career. But this time, every calculated move served a single purpose: not our future, but mine. Richard had left me drowning in debt while he pursued his something real. He had no way of knowing that in doing so, he had inadvertently released something equally real in me, the ambitious, strategic woman I had gradually suppressed to maintain our marriage, a woman who now had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. The woman who would, though neither of us knew it yet, become his worst nightmare. His boss. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The day after Richard's disappearance, I woke before my alarm, my mind already racing with calculations and contingency plans. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't need to consider anyone else's schedule, preferences, or needs. The realization was both liberating and disorienting, like stepping into a room where the furniture had been rearranged. Everything familiar, yet nothing quite where it should be. I made coffee exactly how I liked it. Strong, with just a splash of cream, not the diluted version Richard preferred. This small act of autonomy felt strangely significant as I carried the steaming mug to my home office, a space that had gradually been reduced to a corner desk where I paid bills and organized Richard's tax documents. Today, I reclaimed it entirely, clearing his framed credentials from the wall to make space for my financial command center. I set up 3 distinct workstations: legal, financial, and professional. Each represented a battlefield in the war Richard had unknowingly initiated. My phone had accumulated 17 missed calls overnight, concerned friends who'd heard rumors, Richard's colleagues checking about the canceled dinner, my mother wondering why Richard's sister had suddenly unfriended her on social media. I silenced it without responding. Information was currency now, and I wasn't ready to spend mine explaining a situation I was still mapping out. Instead, I focused on taking inventory, not just of our financial assets and liabilities, but of myself. What resources did I possess beyond bank accounts? What skills had I shelved to maintain our marriage? What connections had I nurtured or neglected? On a fresh legal pad, I created 3 columns: assets, beyond financial finance degree, top of class, Stanford 10 years at Meridian Financial Specialized. Knowledge in risk assessment and portfolio management, industry reputation for analytical precision. Network of former classmates in executive positions, untapped potential recognized by senior management liabilities, beyond financial. Professional growth stunted by prioritizing Richard's career isolation from industry peers due to Richard's insistence that networking events were wastes of time, confidence undermined by years of subtle diminishment, identity heavily intertwined with role as Richard's wife, no independent credit history for major purchases, immediate resources $1,400 in my private emergency fund, kept in a safety deposit box after Richard called it paranoid. My grandmother's jewelry collection, which Richard had unsuccessfully tried to convince me to sell. 3 weeks of accumulated vacation time at Meridian Barbara Kahn, divorce attorney with experience in financial fraud. My Meridian colleague James Chen, now at the SEC, who owed me a favor. This exercise revealed something I hadn't fully acknowledged. While Richard had been systematically draining our financial resources, I had been allowing him to drain something equally valuable: my professional potential. For years, I had accepted his narrative that my career was secondary, that my financial expertise was theoretical rather than practical, that my cautious investment approach indicated a lack of vision rather than prudent risk management. The regional director position I'd been eyeing would normally have been a stretch given my deliberately maintained middle management status. But circumstances had changed dramatically. Extreme situations called for unprecedented action, and I no longer had the luxury of patient incremental career advancement. At 10 a.m., I called Charles Whitman, Meridian's executive vice president, and my department head. "Melissa, how are you feeling today? Still under the weather?" His concern sounded genuine. "Actually, Charles, I need to speak with you privately. Is there a time today that would work?" Something in my tone must have communicated the gravity of the situation. "I can move some things around. Would 1 p.m. work?" "Perfectly. And Charles, I'd prefer if this meeting remained confidential." A brief pause. "Of course." After hanging up, I showered and dressed with deliberate care, choosing a charcoal gray suit I'd purchased for client presentations, but that Richard had dismissed as too severe. I applied makeup that emphasized competence rather than the softer look Richard preferred. I even removed my wedding ring, the indentation on my finger a pale reminder of what had been. Before leaving for the office, I made one more call to Meridian's HR department. "Terry, it's Melissa Maxwell. I need to update my personnel file immediately. I'm legally separating from my husband and need to ensure he has no access to my employment information, compensation details, or benefits." Terry's professional demeanor barely slipped. "I understand. We can process that today. Would you prefer to change back to your maiden name as well?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered reclaiming Melissa Hargrove as part of this transformation. "Yes," I decided on the spot. "Please begin that process." The drive to Meridian's downtown headquarters felt like commuting to a different life. For 10 years, I had taken the same route, parked in the same section, and greeted the same security guards. But today, everything appeared sharper, more defined, as if I was seeing my professional landscape with fresh eyes. Charles was waiting in his office when I arrived, his expression shifting from routine concern to focused attention as I closed the door behind me. "This isn't about being sick," he observed. "No." I placed my portfolio on his desk and sat down. "Charles, I'm going to tell you something in confidence, both as my supervisor and someone I've worked with for a decade. Yesterday morning, my husband abandoned our marriage, leaving me with approximately $200,000 in fraudulent debt acquired without my knowledge or consent." To his credit, Charles maintained his composure, only the slight widening of his eyes indicating surprise. "I've already engaged legal counsel and taken immediate financial precautions," I continued. "However, my circumstances have changed dramatically, overnight. I'm no longer in a position where I can maintain the professional status quo. I understand this is a difficult personal situation, Melissa. Whatever support Meridian can provide, I'm not looking for accommodation, Charles. I'm looking for an opportunity." I leaned forward slightly. "I want to formally express my interest in the regional director position, and I want to make my case for it now, not when the formal interview process begins next month." Charles studied me with new interest. "That's unusually direct for you, Melissa. My circumstances require directness. My qualifications, however, remain objectively strong regardless of my personal situation." I opened my portfolio and presented him with the document I'd prepared at 5 a.m., a detailed analysis of Meridian's regional performance gaps and my strategic plan to address them. "You prepared this overnight?" He flipped through the pages with growing interest. "I've been preparing it mentally for 3 years, Charles. I simply hadn't put it on paper until now." For the next 30 minutes, I outlined my vision for the regional director role, identifying inefficiencies in our current portfolio management approach, suggesting restructuring of underperforming client segments, and proposing a risk assessment model I'd developed but never formally presented. When I finished, Charles was silent for a moment, looking at me as if seeing someone new across the desk. "You know," he finally said, "Richard mentioned at the Meridian golf tournament last spring that you were comfortable in your current role, that you preferred work-life balance to advancement pressure." The revelation stung but didn't surprise me. Another way Richard had contained my growth, another boundary established without my knowledge. "Richard no longer speaks for me," I replied evenly. professionally or otherwise. Charles nodded slowly. The regional director position requires someone who can handle significant pressure, make high-stakes decisions, and manage complex financial strategies while leading a team of 30 professionals. All of which I am not only capable of but eager to demonstrate. I maintained steady eye contact. I realize I'm asking you to consider me outside the normal advancement path, Charles. But I'm also offering Meridian something valuable, a senior manager who is suddenly highly motivated to exceed every performance metric you establish. Because you need the increased compensation, he observed. Because I need to prove something, I corrected him. Not just to Meridian, and certainly not to Richard. I need to prove something to myself. Charles closed my portfolio and handed it back to me. The interview committee meets on Friday. I'll need this converted into a formal presentation by Thursday afternoon. It wasn't a yes, but it was an opportunity. You'll have it tomorrow morning. As I stood to leave, Charles added, For what it's worth, Melissa, several of us have wondered for years why you weren't pursuing more senior positions. Your analytical work has consistently outperformed your job description. The validation from a respected superior, acknowledging what Richard had consistently minimized, was unexpectedly emotional. I managed a professional nod despite the sudden tightness in my throat. Sometimes we only recognize our own barriers when someone else removes them for us, I replied, even if they didn't intend to do us any favors. As I walked back to my office, straighter and more purposeful than I had entered, I realized that Richard's betrayal had inadvertently released me from something I hadn't fully recognized, the careful restraint of my professional self to maintain the balance he preferred in our marriage. Richard had left with another woman, stolen our financial security, and attempted to drown me in debt. He couldn't have known that in doing so, he had actually cut me loose from anchors I hadn't even realized were holding me in place. 3 days after Richard's disappearance, I faced my first weekend alone in our suburban 4-bedroom house. The emptiness echoed in ways I hadn't anticipated, not with loneliness, but with revelation. Moving from room to room, I began to see our home not as the warm sanctuary Richard had always described in his Christmas letters to friends and family, but as a carefully constructed stage set for the life he wanted to project. The formal living room we never used but maintained for entertaining his colleagues. The chef's kitchen where he'd occasionally prepare elaborate meals when clients came over, leaving me to clean the aftermath. The home office was decorated with his awards and credentials, my single finance industry recognition tucked behind a potted plant. Even our bedroom featured the heavy masculine furniture he'd selected when we moved in, my preference for something lighter dismissed as lacking sophistication. I opened his closet, still filled with tailored suits and monogrammed shirts. Richard had only taken what he needed for his new California life, confident that he could simply replace material possessions. His cologne still lingered in the fabric, the expensive sandalwood blend I'd given him on our last anniversary. I closed the door firmly, sealing the scent away. In the master bathroom, I discovered the first revealing oversight in Richard's calculated exit, a prescription bottle of Propecia, hidden behind his electric razor. The hair loss medication he'd been secretly taking for 2 years, while attributing his still thick head of hair to good genes. A small deception in the grand scheme of things, but emblematic of Richard's carefully maintained illusions. By midday, I found myself in the basement storage room, pulling out boxes of financial records I'd meticulously organized, but that Richard had insisted we didn't need cluttering the main living space. Year by year, I excavated our financial history, spread it across the basement floor, and began reconstructing the true narrative of our marriage. The evidence was painfully clear. While I had believed we were building a secure future together, Richard had been systematically positioning himself for independent success. The investments I thought were joint had fine print giving him controlling interest. The vacation property in the Poconos that we'd purchased together had been refinanced without my knowledge, the equity withdrawn. Even my inheritance from my father, which Richard had insisted we invest in our future, had been directed into ventures that primarily benefited his portfolio. Most telling were the career trajectories documented in our tax returns. Richard's income had quadrupled over 15 years as he climbed the corporate ladder at Westbrook Investments. Mine had increased by a modest 32% despite my advanced degree and consistently positive performance reviews. The disparity wasn't accidental, it was architectural. Among the papers, I found a life insurance policy Richard had taken out on me 5 years earlier, $750,000 with him as the sole beneficiary. We had no children to provide for, and he'd never mentioned this policy. The discovery sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. Had he ever considered an even more permanent form of abandonment? My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Honey, Richard's mother called me. She says you're not returning anyone's calls and they're worried. What should I tell her?" I stared at the message, realizing I'd been avoiding the social fallout of Richard's departure. How much did his family know? What story had he told them? The questions triggered something unexpected. Not anxiety about social judgment, but irritation at the emotional labor expected of me even now. I was supposed to manage everyone else's feelings about Richard's betrayal while simultaneously handling the financial disaster he'd created. "Tell her I'm dealing with some unexpected challenges Richard left behind," I texted back. "I'll reach out when I'm ready." My phone immediately rang. My mother, predictably, wanting more information. I silenced it and turned back to the financial archaeology spread across the basement floor. By evening, I had compiled a comprehensive timeline of Richard's financial deceptions, small at first, growing increasingly bold as my trust in his financial management deepened. The most damning discovery was a series of transfers to an account labeled West Coast Opportunity Fund, beginning 18 months ago, around the time Vanessa had joined his department. I photographed everything, organized the most critical documents into a folder for Barbara, and then did something Richard would never have expected. I rebuilt our entire financial history in a detailed spreadsheet, creating visualizations that clearly demonstrated the pattern of his misappropriation. 10 hours of concentrated work that leveraged the financial analysis skills Richard had consistently dismissed as too academic for the real world. At midnight, I emailed the file to Barbara with a simple message: "Evidence for our case. Also, prepared for potential criminal charges if necessary." Her response came surprisingly quickly. "This is extraordinary work, Melissa. We should discuss how far you want to take this. Some clients prefer quieter resolutions even with strong evidence." I stared at her message, understanding the implication. Many women in my position would prioritize a quick, private divorce over public exposure of their husband's financial crimes. That path would be cleaner, faster, less emotionally taxing. Richard was probably counting on that very calculation. My desire to avoid embarrassment outweighing my pursuit of justice. "I want everything the law allows," I wrote back. "Nothing quiet about it." Sunday morning, I woke with a clarity that had eluded me for years. The weight of managing Richard's expectations, accommodating his preferences, and supporting his ambitions had been so gradual, so incremental, that I hadn't recognized how heavy the burden had become until it was suddenly lifted. I showered in, water as hot as I could stand, washing away the basement dust and metaphorical cobwebs. In the steamy bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection with objective eyes. At 41, I was still attractive, though I'd allowed Richard's occasional comments about watching those extra few pounds to make me self-conscious. My dark hair had subtle threads of silver that he'd encouraged me to color. The fine lines around my eyes spoke of an experience Richard had suggested I talk to a dermatologist about. On impulse, I opened the drawer containing the expensive anti-aging creams and serums Richard had given me last Christmas. "Just to maintain what you have, honey." and dropped them into the trash. Petty, perhaps, but deeply satisfying. Dressed in jeans and a sweater I'd rarely worn because Richard found it too casual, I drove to the local coffee shop instead of making coffee at home. Another small act of liberation, spending $5 on a latte when Richard had always insisted that coffee is coffee and premium cafes were for people who don't understand compound interest. As I sipped my perfectly crafted overpriced coffee, I opened my laptop and began crafting my presentation for the regional director position at Meridian. Charles had given me until Thursday, but I intended to deliver by Monday afternoon, partly to demonstrate my efficiency, but mostly because I needed to channel my churning emotions into productive action. The presentation took shape quickly, drawing on analysis I'd been mentally perfecting for years. I outlined Meridian's regional challenges with clear-eyed precision, identified opportunities our current leadership had overlooked, and proposed a restructuring that would significantly improve portfolio performance while reducing operational costs. The work absorbed me so completely that I barely noticed when someone sat down at the neighboring table, until a familiar voice broke my concentration. "Melissa? I thought that was you." I looked up to find James Chen, my former colleague from Meridian who now worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission. The same James Chen who owed me a professional favor after I'd helped him navigate a potentially career-ending mistake 3 years earlier. "James," I acknowledged, closing my laptop slightly. "It's been a while." He nodded, his expression suggesting he'd heard something about my situation. "I tried calling you yesterday. I'm in town for a conference and thought we might catch up." The calculated casual tone told me everything. News of Richard's departure had reached our professional circles, and James, like everyone else, was curious about the details. Instead of offering the expected emotional response, I made a decision. That would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. "Actually, James, your timing is excellent. I could use your expertise on something." I reopened my laptop, but instead of showing him my Meridian presentation, I pulled up the timeline of Richard's financial activities I'd created. Hypothetically speaking, how interested would the SEC be in this pattern of behavior from a senior investment advisor? James's eyes widened as he scanned the financial timeline on my screen. His coffee sat forgotten as he leaned closer, professional interest. "Overtaking personal curiosity? This is Richard's activity?" he asked, voice lowered despite the ambient noise of the Sunday morning coffee shop. "Hypothetically speaking," I reminded him, though we both knew there was nothing hypothetical about the meticulously documented financial malfeasance displayed in my spreadsheets. James's finger traced a particular sequence of transactions, the series of transfers to the West Coast Opportunity Fund, that coincided with Vanessa's appearance in our lives. "These transfers crossed state lines," he noted, "and if they were executed without your knowledge using jointly held assets." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "Melissa, this isn't just divorce territory. This could potentially qualify as wire fraud." The word hung between us: fraud, criminal, not just civil. A path that would transform Richard's calculated exit strategy into something with far more severe consequences than alimony payments. "Hypothetically," I continued, maintaining the thin veneer of deniability, "would the SEC be interested in examining a senior investment advisor who might be misappropriating client funds alongside personal assets?" James set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "If you're asking whether the SEC investigates financial professionals who demonstrate patterns of deceptive practices, the answer is absolutely. We consider it a significant red flag when someone shows willingness to commit fraud in their personal finances. And would such an investigation be public record? Once formal charges are filed, yes." He studied me with new appreciation. "Melissa, what exactly are you planning?" I closed my laptop, suddenly aware that the coffee shop, with its weekend crowd of familiar neighborhood faces, wasn't the appropriate venue for this conversation. "I'm planning to rebuild my life, James," starting with a foundation of truth, rather than convenient fictions. He nodded slowly. I'm staying at the Marriott downtown. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private? Say, 1 hour from now? I'll be there. As I drove to the Marriott, I wrestled with the implications of involving the SEC. Barbara had warned that pursuing financial justice could complicate and extend the divorce proceedings. The conventional wisdom was clear. Extract yourself as cleanly and quickly as possible, especially when the perpetrator had already moved on to another relationship. But conventional wisdom assumed conventional motivations. It assumed I wanted to move on, to heal, to find another relationship. What if what I wanted was something entirely different? The hotel conference room James secured for our meeting offered the anonymity and professional setting this conversation required. He had brought his laptop and a notepad, the federal regulator now fully engaged despite his weekend status. Before we go further, he said as I set up my materials, I need to understand your objectives, Melissa. There are multiple paths forward from what you've shown me, with very different outcomes. I appreciated his directness. I want 3 things, James. First, I want financial recovery, not just from the divorce settlement, but full restoration of what was taken from me. Second, I want professional consequences for Richard's actions. And third, I paused, carefully selecting my words. I want him to face me directly when it happens. James leaned back in his chair, assessing me with new eyes. The first 2 are straightforward legal matters. That third objective is more personal. Yes. You understand that SEC investigations typically take months, sometimes years, and that we don't choreograph confrontations between parties. I understand the standard process, I acknowledged. I also understand that how information reaches the SEC can significantly impact the trajectory of an investigation. A slight smile touched James's lips. You've done some research. I've had 3 days with nothing but time and motivation. For the next 2 hours, James and I engaged in what could only be described as strategic planning, examining Richard's financial activities through the lens of securities regulations, identifying which actions crossed the line from unethical to illegal, and mapping out a documentation trail that would be compelling to federal investigators. The strongest case involves these transactions. James indicated a cluster of transfers in my timeline. If Richard used client funds or leveraged insider information to finance these investments, that's where the SEC's interest would be most focused. And the California property purchases? If he used fraudulently obtained funds for those transactions, they could potentially be subject to asset freezes or forfeitures. James made another note. Melissa, I have to ask, how did you miss these activities as they were happening? With your financial background? The question stung, but it was valid. Richard compartmentalized our finances early in our marriage, I explained. He handled investments and major assets. I managed household expenses and my own retirement account. He created a narrative that his investment approach was sophisticated and dynamic, too complex to explain in the limited time we had together. Paused, confronting the uncomfortable truth. And I accepted that narrative because it was easier than questioning whether my husband respected my financial expertise. It was easier to believe he was protecting me from complexity rather than hiding his deceptions. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. Reminds me of the Madoff case. Even financial professionals can be deceived by those they trust. The proximity blinds you to patterns you'd immediately recognize in a stranger's behavior. His comparison to one of history's most notorious financial criminals wasn't lost on me. Richard isn't Bernie Madoff, I said. No, James agreed. Madoff's fraud was measured in billions. But the psychology, the manipulation of trust, the creation of information asymmetry, the careful cultivation of a particular image, that's remarkably similar. As our meeting concluded, James outlined next steps with the clinical precision of a federal investigator. I'll take this information back to my superiors as a confidential tip. Given the evidence you've compiled and Richard's position at Westbrook, they'll likely open a preliminary inquiry. That process is internal and confidential. And if they find cause to proceed, then it becomes an official investigation. Westbrook would be notified, Richard would be interviewed, and depending on the findings, civil charges could be filed. Criminal referrals would go to the Justice Department if warranted. I gathered my materials, mentally calculating timelines. How long is the preliminary inquiry? Typically 4 to 6 weeks. But Melissa, he added with emphasis, once this process begins, it has its own momentum. The SEC isn't a tool for personal vendettas. I'm not pursuing a vendetta, James. I'm pursuing justice, and there's a difference. I held his gaze steadily. Richard made a calculated decision to betray not just our marriage, but our financial partnership. He assumed I would be too emotional, too embarrassed, or too intimidated to hold him fully accountable. And he was wrong about that, James observed. He was wrong about many things. I extended my hand professionally. Thank you for your guidance. Today. As I drove home from the Marriott, a notification appeared on my phone, an email from Barbara with divorce papers ready for my review. The legal process was proceeding on schedule, creating the foundation for my financial separation from Richard. But the SEC angle represented something different, a consequence Richard hadn't anticipated in his risk calculation. At home, I returned to the presentation I was preparing for Meridian. The regional director position now represented more than career advancement or financial necessity. It was the first structural element in rebuilding my life on my own terms. I worked until midnight, refining my analysis and strengthening my recommendations. When I finally closed my laptop, I realized I had spent the entire day focused on strategy and action, not on grief or betrayal. The emotions were still there, of course, hurt, anger, humiliation simmering beneath the surface, but they had been channeled into productive energy rather than consuming me. Monday morning, I arrived at Meridian an hour early, dressed in a navy suit that communicated authority without apology. I had my presentation ready, my strategy mapped out, and a new understanding of exactly what I was capable of when necessity stripped away self-doubt. Charles looked surprised when I appeared in his doorway. Melissa, I wasn't expecting you until Thursday. I prefer to exceed expectations rather than merely meet them, I replied, placing my presentation folder on his desk, especially when circumstances require exceptional performance. He glanced at the folder, then back at me with newfound respect. I've cleared my calendar until 9. Walk me through your vision for the regional division. For the next hour, I presented not just a plan for managing Meridian's regional office, but a comprehensive strategy for transforming its performance. I outlined inefficiencies in the current structure, opportunities for portfolio optimization, and specific metrics for measuring success. I didn't just demonstrate knowledge of regional operations, I showed how my analytical approach could extract value others had missed. When I finished, Charles was silent for a long moment, studying me with new consideration. This is exceptional. Work, Melissa, particularly given the tight timeline and your personal circumstances. My circumstances have clarified my priorities, Charles, not diminished my capabilities. He nodded slowly. The interview committee won't meet until Friday, but I'll make sure they have copies of this presentation beforehand. In the meantime, I'd like you to head the Miller account transition. It's our largest regional client, and the lead analyst position just opened up. The Miller account, a $200 million portfolio that represented nearly 30% of our regional business, the kind of high-visibility assignment that could cement my candidacy for the director position. I appreciate the opportunity, I said, careful, to maintain professional composure despite the significance of this vote of confidence. I'll start today. As I left Charles's office, my phone vibrated with an incoming text. Unknown number. but the content made the sender unmistakable. "We need to talk about these accounts you've frozen. This isn't fair to Vanessa and me. Richard?" I stared at the message, its audacity almost impressive. After abandoning me with fraudulent debt and ghosting all communication, Richard's first direct contact was to complain about inconvenience to him and his mistress. I deleted the message without responding and turned my attention to the Miller, account files waiting on my desk. Richard had chosen his path, calculating that I would follow familiar patterns of emotional response and conflict avoidance. But his calculations had failed to account for a critical variable. The woman he thought he knew no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood exactly how to architect consequences he hadn't imagined possible. By the end of my first week as lead analyst on the Miller account, I had established a new rhythm to my days, one built around reclamation, rather than accommodation. Each morning began with a strategy session for the Miller portfolio, followed by meticulous documentation of the account's historical performance gaps. Evenings were dedicated to gathering evidence for Barbara and building my case for the regional director position. Sleep had become a tactical resource rather than a necessity. 5 hours a night, precisely scheduled, with no time wasted staring at the ceiling or processing emotions. Those luxury items could wait until after I had secured my professional and financial future. Richard's attempts at contact continued, evolving from terse demands to increasingly desperate pleas as the reality of his situation became clear. His access to our joint accounts remained frozen. Credit cards were being declined. Westbrook Investments had placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review, the first ripple effect of the SEC's preliminary inquiry. "Melissa, please call me back. This has gotten out of hand. We can work this out between us without lawyers and regulators." His most recent voicemail carried a tension I'd rarely heard from Richard, whose cultivated confidence had always been his defining characteristic. I saved each message without responding, forwarding them to Barbara as evidence of attempted contact outside approved legal channels. The old Melissa would have felt compelled to explain, to justify, to soothe his anxiety even after his betrayal. The new Melissa recognized these reactions as conditioned responses that no longer served me. Friday morning arrived with crisp autumn, sunlight streaming through Meridian's glass-walled conference room. The interview committee, Charles, 2 senior directors, and the head of HR, sat across from me, my presentation folders open before them. "Ms. Hargrove," Charles began, purposefully using my reclaimed maiden name, "we've reviewed your proposal for regional operations, and I must say it's generated considerable discussion among our leadership team." I nodded, maintaining composed eye contact. I imagine any significant operational restructuring would warrant thorough examination. The head of HR, Elaine Peterson, leaned forward slightly. "What's especially noteworthy is how your proposal identifies inefficiencies that our current management has either overlooked or accepted as inevitable." "Nothing in finance is inevitable," I replied, "only inadequately analyzed." A slight smile touched Charles's lips. "That's precisely the perspective we need to discuss. Your analytical approach is exceptional, but the regional director role requires more than analysis. It demands leadership, strategic vision, and the ability to drive organizational change, often in the face of resistance. Which is why my proposal includes a phased implementation strategy with specific metrics for measuring adoption and effectiveness," I countered. "Change management is most successful when results provide their own validation." For the next hour, the committee tested my readiness with increasingly complex scenarios. Managing underperforming team members, handling client objections to fee structures, balancing short-term results against long-term portfolio stability. Each question probed not just my financial knowledge but my leadership philosophy and decision-making process. "One final question, Ms. Hargrove," the senior risk director said, consulting his notes. "Given your recent personal circumstances, which, We understand are challenging. How can Meridian be confident that those external pressures won't impact your performance in such a critical role? The question was professionally phrased but pointed directly at the elephant in the room. My pending divorce, the financial chaos Richard had created, and the significant career leap I was attempting in the midst of personal crisis. I understand your concern, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. But I would suggest that my performance this week on the Miller account, while managing those same external pressures, offers a more relevant answer than any assurance I could provide. I opened a folder I had brought separately from my presentation. Materials. This is my preliminary analysis of the Miller portfolio, identifying 3 specific areas where performance optimization could increase returns by approximately 4.2% annually while reducing volatility. I slid the document across the table. I completed this alongside my regular responsibilities and personal obligations. Under normal circumstances, such analysis might take weeks. I delivered it in 5 days. Charles picked up the analysis, eyebrows raising slightly as he scanned the content. This is rather comprehensive for a preliminary review. Yes, I agreed simply. It is. The committee exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them before Charles closed the folder. Thank you, Ms. Hargrove. We'll be making our decision early next week. In the meantime, please continue your excellent work with the Miller account. I exited the conference room with measured steps, maintaining professional composure until I reached my office. Only then, with the door closed, did I allow myself a moment to acknowledge what I had just done, challenge the established career progression path at Meridian, while simultaneously demonstrating capabilities that had long been overlooked. My phone vibrated with an incoming call. Barbara with an update on the divorce proceedings. We've received a response from Richard's attorney, she informed me. They're proposing a settlement that would split the debt equally between you, with Richard taking responsibility for 70% of the asset division. That's not acceptable, I replied immediately. The debt was fraudulently acquired without my knowledge. I won't accept a single dollar of responsibility for it. Barbara sighed, though I detected a note of approval beneath her professional caution. They anticipated that response. Their counterposition is that as his spouse, you benefited from the lifestyle those funds provided, regardless of your knowledge about their source. Did Richard's attorney explain how exactly I benefited from funds transferred to the West Coast Opportunity Fund, that coincidentally began when his relationship with Vanessa did? The question emerged with more edge than I intended. Actually, that's where things get interesting, Barbara said, her tone shifting. Richard is claiming those transfers were legitimate investments in a California property development fund, not personal expenses for his relationship. He's provided documentation showing the fund exists and has legitimate investors. I processed this information, mentally recategorizing it from evidence of affair-related spending to something potentially more complicated and more legally significant. Barbara, if Richard was directing clients to invest in this same fund, while personally involved with it, would that represent a conflict of interest? Potentially. It would depend on whether he disclosed his involvement and whether he received any undisclosed benefits from directing client investments there. She paused. Why do you ask? Just connecting dots, I replied, maintaining professional discretion about my parallel conversation with the SEC. Can you send me the documentation his attorney provided about this fund? Already in your email. Review it carefully. There's something about the timing that doesn't align with his other statements. After ending the call with Barbara, I opened the documents Richard's attorney had submitted. Incorporation papers for West Coast Opportunity Fund, LLC, dated 18 months earlier, with Richard listed as a founding partner alongside a name I didn't recognize, Vincent Schaefer. A quick LinkedIn search revealed Vincent Schaefer as a real estate developer based in San Diego, and a familiar face from Richard's business trips to California over the past 2 years. Trips that had grown increasingly frequent and always featured prominently in Richard's humble bragging social media posts about expanding horizons and high-level networking. I forwarded the documentation to James with a brief note. Potential. Additional angle. Richard claims a legitimate investment vehicle, but timing coincides with both the relationship and his increased client recommendations for California property investments. His response came within minutes. This changes the complexity of the potential case, sending to our real estate investment fraud team for review. As I prepared to leave the office that Friday evening, Charles appeared in my doorway, an unusual occurrence this late in the day. "Do you have plans this weekend, Melissa?" he asked, his tone casual, but his expression suggesting the question was more significant than it appeared. "Nothing that can't be adjusted if needed," I replied, instantly, alert to the possibility that this might relate to the regional director position. "Good. The board has called an emergency session for tomorrow morning regarding some concerning information they've received about Westbrook Investments. Given your work on the Miller account, which has significant holdings managed by Westbrook, your insight would be valuable." My heart rate accelerated slightly, though I maintained a neutral expression. "What kind of information?" Charles glanced into the hallway before responding, his voice lowered. "Preliminary indications of potential improprieties in their West Coast Development Fund. Several of our clients, including Miller, have substantial positions there based on Westbrook's recommendations. The West Coast Opportunity Fund, Richard's fund, the very entity I had flagged to the SEC just days earlier. What time tomorrow?" I asked, careful to show appropriate professional concern without revealing my personal connection to the matter. 9 a.m., Boardroom A. Charles studied me for a moment. "You don't seem surprised." I composed my response carefully. "Financial improprieties rarely emerge without warning signs, Charles. The challenge is recognizing those signs before they escalate to crisis." He nodded slowly. "That's precisely the perspective we need tomorrow. The board wants to understand our exposure and options before the markets open Monday." After Charles left, I sat in my darkened office, processing the accelerating timeline. What I had expected to take weeks was unfolding in days. The SEC's preliminary inquiry had clearly uncovered something significant enough to warrant notifying Meridian's board immediately. My phone vibrated with another call from Richard, his fifth today. This time I answered. "Melissa, thank God," he blurted, relief evident in his voice. "We need to talk. Things are happening that you don't understand." "I understand perfectly, Richard," I interrupted, my voice steady and clinical. "And I'll be in Boardroom A at Meridian tomorrow morning when the board discusses exactly what's happening with your West Coast Opportunity Fund." The silence that followed contained its own kind of eloquence, the sound of Richard's carefully constructed reality collapsing entirely. Saturday morning dawned with the particular clarity that follows a night of minimal sleep and maximum preparation. After Richard's stunned silence on the phone, he had launched into a frantic explanation about misunderstandings and temporary liquidity issues with the West Coast Fund, technical language designed to obscure the simple truth. He had been directing client investments, including those from Meridian's portfolios, into a venture where he held undisclosed personal interest. Had listened without interruption, recording the call with a phone app Barbara had recommended for precisely this purpose. When he finally ran out of explanations, I had responded with a single question. "Does Vanessa know about the SEC inquiry?" His hesitation told me everything. "This isn't about Vanessa," he'd stammered. "This is about a misunderstanding that could damage both our reputations." "My reputation is built on integrity and analytical accuracy, Richard. What's yours built on?" I had ended the call then, turning my attention to preparing for the board meeting, reviewing Meridian's exposure to Westbrook recommended investments, particularly those connected to the California Property Fund, and compiling a preliminary risk assessment based on available information. Now, dressed in a charcoal suit that communicated serious competence, I arrived at Meridian's offices 30 minutes before the scheduled emergency board meeting. The Saturday morning security guard looked surprised to see me but waved me through with a respectful nod. The executive floor was eerily quiet, the usual weekday bustle replaced by the muted anticipation of crisis management. In the hallway outside Boardroom A, Charles was engaged in a hushed conversation with Elaine from HR and two board members I recognized from company events. "Melissa," Charles beckoned me over, making quick introductions. "I was just explaining your work on the Miller account and your background in risk assessment." Gregory Walsh, Meridian's board chairman, studied me with evaluative interest. "Charles mentioned you've prepared some preliminary analysis of our exposure?" "Yes, sir," I confirmed, retrieving my tablet. "Based on the information available, I've mapped Meridian's client positions in Westbrook Managed Investments, with particular attention to their California real estate ventures." I displayed a visualization I'd created overnight, a network diagram showing the interconnections between Meridian client accounts, Westbrook investment vehicles, and ultimate fund destinations. The West Coast Opportunity Fund appeared as a central node, connecting to multiple client portfolios including, prominently, the Miller account. "Impressive work, especially on such short notice," Walsh commented, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the implications. "How did you compile this so quickly?" "Pattern recognition is my specialty," I replied, careful to remain professional rather than revealing my personal connection to the information. Once I identified the consistent routing of funds through specific Westbrook vehicles to California, property investments, the structure became clear. Walsh exchanged glances with the other board member before addressing Charles. "We should begin. The SEC representatives will be joining us in 15 minutes. My pulse quickened. "The SEC is attending this meeting?" "Yes," Charles confirmed. "They contacted our compliance department late yesterday with specific questions about our relationship with Westbrook. Given the potential regulatory implications, we invited them to brief the board directly." As we entered the boardroom, I maintained outward composure while internally processing this development. James had mentioned the preliminary inquiry might take weeks. Instead, the SEC was already engaging directly with Meridian, which meant they had found something significant enough to warrant immediate intervention. The boardroom filled quickly with senior executives, legal counsel, and compliance officers. I took a seat toward the back, appropriate to my current position within the company hierarchy despite my involvement in the analysis. Charles, however, motioned me to a seat closer to the main table. "We'll need your insights as this unfolds," he explained quietly, "particularly regarding the Miller account exposure." At precisely 9 o'clock, Meridian's head of security escorted two individuals into the room, a stern-faced woman in her 50s whom I didn't recognize, and James Chen, who gave no indication that he knew me beyond professional courtesy. "Thank you for accommodating this unusual weekend meeting," the woman began after introductions confirmed her as Diane Lockhart, SEC Associate Director of Enforcement. "As you're aware, the SEC has opened an investigation into certain activities at Westbrook Investments, particularly relating to their West Coast Real Estate Development Fund." She proceeded to outline, in carefully precise terms, the preliminary findings that had triggered the accelerated timeline. Westbrook's senior advisor Richard Maxwell had been directing client funds into an investment vehicle in which he held a significant undisclosed interest, creating a clear conflict of interest that violated both SEC regulations and Westbrook's fiduciary responsibilities. Our initial review suggests approximately $42 million of investor funds have been directed to this entity over the past 18 months, Lockhart continued, including substantial positions from Meridian client portfolios. The room remained silent as the implications sank in. Walsh finally spoke. "What's the status of these investments now? Are client funds at risk of loss?" James Chen stepped forward then, opening his portfolio. "That's where the situation becomes more concerning." Our preliminary investigation indicates that while the West Coast Opportunity Fund does exist as a legal entity, the actual property developments it supposedly funded are significantly overstated in investor materials. He displayed a series of photographs on the boardroom screen, empty lots and partially constructed buildings in various California locations, each labeled with the impressive development names that had appeared in Westbrook's glossy investment materials. These were taken yesterday by our San Diego field office, James explained. As you can see, many of these luxury developments are either bare land or projects abandoned in early construction phases, despite investor materials showing completed properties generating rental income. The revelation sent a ripple of murmured concern through the boardroom. This wasn't just a technical violation of disclosure requirements, it carried hallmarks of actual fraud. "What are the next steps from the SEC's perspective?" Charles asked, his expression grave. "We've already instructed Westbrook to freeze all accounts connected to the fund pending our investigation," Lockhart replied. "We're working with the U.S. Attorney's Office to determine whether criminal charges are warranted. For Meridian's part, we'll need complete access to all records relating to client investments in Westbrook-recommended vehicles, particularly those connected to West Coast properties." As the discussion continued, focusing on Meridian's compliance obligations and client protection strategies, I maintained professional attention while my mind processed the personal implications of what was unfolding. Richard hadn't just left me with fraudulent debt. He had been operating a sophisticated investment scheme that now threatened the financial security of Meridian's clients. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours, with technical questions about exposure limits, client communication strategies, and regulatory reporting requirements. Throughout, I provided specific insights about the Miller account's vulnerability, demonstrating both my detailed knowledge of the portfolio and my analytical approach to risk mitigation. As the meeting concluded, Walsh addressed the room with the measured gravity of experienced leadership. "Our priority must be protecting our clients while fully cooperating with the investigation. Charles, I want your team to prepare a comprehensive analysis of all affected accounts by Monday morning. We need to understand our total exposure before markets open." Charles nodded, then gestured toward me. "Melissa Hargrove has already completed preliminary mapping of our most significant exposures. I recommend she lead the weekend analysis team." Walsh considered this briefly, then nodded. "Approved. Ms. Hargrove, you'll have whatever resources you need. Our client's security depends on accuracy and speed here." As the board members and SEC representatives filed out, Charles pulled me aside. "I know this is an enormous responsibility on short notice, especially given your personal situation." I met his gaze steadily. "My personal situation has only enhanced my motivation to identify and address financial misconduct, Charles." A knowing look crossed his features. "I suspected as much. The thoroughness of your preliminary analysis suggested more than professional diligence." He paused. "Is there anything about your connection to this situation that I should know as your supervisor?" The question required careful consideration. Full disclosure might be professionally appropriate, but it could also potentially complicate my involvement in Meridian's response. "My pending divorce involves Richard Maxwell," I acknowledged, deciding transparency was the safer approach. "However, my analysis is based entirely on Meridian's client data and publicly available information about Westbrook's investment structures." Charles absorbed this without visible surprise. "I suspected there might be a connection when you suddenly took interest in the regional director position." He considered for a moment. "Does the SEC know about your personal connection to Maxwell?" "Yes," I confirmed. "I've been fully transparent with them about my relationship." He nodded slowly. "Good. That eliminates potential conflicts from Meridian's perspective." He checked his watch. "I need to brief the CEO before he returns from Tokyo. You have authorization to assemble a team of analysts, whoever you need through the weekend. The board will reconvene Sunday evening to review your findings. As Charles departed, I stood alone in the boardroom, the weight of responsibility settling alongside an unexpected sense of validation. In less than a week, I had transformed from Richard's abandoned wife struggling with fraudulent debt to the analyst leading Meridian's response to his investment scheme. The professional trust being placed in me during a critical situation affecting millions in client assets contrasted sharply with Richard's persistent diminishment of my financial capabilities throughout our marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. His deception had created the very crisis that was now showcasing my expertise. My phone vibrated with an incoming text from an unknown number. "This is Vanessa. We need to talk about Richard. It's urgent." I stared at the message, considering the implications of Richard's mistress reaching out directly. Was this a desperate attempt at damage control? Or something else entirely? After a moment's reflection, I typed a response. "I'm working on critical analysis until tomorrow evening. I can meet you Monday morning, 7 a.m. at Meridian's office." Her reply came instantly. "I'll be there. There are things you need to know." The weekend passed in a blur of intense focus. I assembled a team of Meridian's top analysts, converting a conference room into a command center for mapping our clients' exposure to Richard's scheme. Sleep became an optional luxury as we constructed a comprehensive picture of the damage. Nearly $18 million of Meridian client funds had been directed to Westbrook's California ventures, with the Miller account representing the largest single, exposure at $4.2 million. By Sunday evening, we had prepared a detailed presentation for the board, complete with risk assessments, client impact analyses, and recommended mitigation strategies. The board meeting proceeded with the controlled urgency of experienced professionals managing a crisis, with my analysis forming the foundation for Meridian's response plan. Ms. Hargrove's team has produced extraordinary work under extreme time pressure, Walsh commented as we concluded the presentation. This level of detailed analysis would typically take weeks, not days. Charles nodded in agreement. Melissa has demonstrated exceptional leadership throughout this situation. Her background in risk assessment has proven invaluable. The professional validation was satisfying, but even more significant was the subtle shift in how Meridian's leadership now perceived me. Not as a mid-level analyst with solid technical skills, but as someone capable of strategic leadership during a crisis. Monday morning arrived with the gray light of early autumn. I reached Meridian at 6:30 a.m., allowing time to prepare for my meeting with Vanessa. I had spent the brief hours between the board meeting and my return to the office researching everything I could find about her. LinkedIn profile showing her rapid promotion at Westbrook before her abrupt transfer 6 months ago. Instagram photos featuring expensive vacations that seemed beyond her likely salary, and a now-deleted profile on a professional networking site that mentioned her expertise in client relationship management for high-net-worth portfolio development. I chose to meet her in a small conference room near Meridian's reception area, rather than my office, maintaining professional territory while keeping her separate from the secured areas where our crisis response was headquartered. At precisely 7 a.m., reception called to announce her arrival. I instructed them to escort her up, using the time to center myself. Whatever Vanessa wanted, whatever things I needed to know, I was determined to maintain the emotional equilibrium I had established since Richard's departure. The woman who entered the conference room bore little resemblance to the polished, confident figure from her social media. Vanessa Parker looked exhausted, her designer outfit slightly rumpled, her typically perfect makeup applied with less precision than her photos suggested was her norm. At 28, she should have projected youthful energy. Instead, she carried the weight of someone who had discovered the true cost of her choices. "Thank you for meeting me," she began, setting her designer handbag on the table between us. "I know this is uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable doesn't begin to describe the situation," I replied evenly, "but I'm listening." She took a deep breath, hands clasped tightly before her. Richard lied to me. He lied to everyone. And now he's gone. This was not what I had expected. Gone? Since when? Saturday night, after the SEC contacted Westbrook formally. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, a nervous gesture. He told me he needed to handle some business complications and would be back Sunday morning. He took his passport and cash from our safe. His phone goes straight to voicemail. I processed this information, professional analysis overtaking personal reaction. If Richard had fled, the implications for the investigation and for recovery of diverted funds became significantly more complicated. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, studying her with careful neutrality. Her composure fractured slightly. "Because I'm scared. Because the FBI visited our condo yesterday asking questions about offshore accounts I knew nothing about. Because Richard told me you were a vindictive ex who couldn't accept that he'd moved on. But now I'm finding out that everything he told me was a lie." "Including what, specifically?" I prompted, needing clarity rather than emotional declarations. "That you had agreed to the divorce months ago but were making it difficult out of spite. That the debt was accumulated jointly during your marriage for investments you had both approved. That you had your own secret accounts he'd discovered." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "That you were emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible." The character assassination shouldn't have surprised me, yet hearing Richard's fabricated narrative laid bare still carried a sting. He had constructed an entire alternate reality to justify his betrayal. "None of that is true," I stated simply. "I know that now." Vanessa's voice held the hollow resignation of someone confronting an unwelcome truth. "I found documents in his home office after the FBI left. Financial records, account statements, notes about transferring client funds. And this," she reached into her bag, withdrawing a folder which she pushed across the table. "He had this in a hidden safe behind his desk calendar." Inside the folder, I found what appeared to be a contingency plan. Details of banking contacts in countries without U.S. extradition treaties, identity documentation under a slightly altered name, and property listings in Malaysia. Most damning was a handwritten list of account numbers with corresponding client names, including several Meridian clients, and notation of transfer completion dates extending back 18 months. "This is evidence of criminal activity," I said quietly, already calculating how this documentation would impact the SEC investigation. "I know." Vanessa's hands trembled slightly. "That's why I brought it to you instead of turning it over to the FBI directly. I thought you deserved to see it first, given what he did to you." I studied her with renewed assessment. "Why would you extend that consideration to me? We're hardly allies in this situation." She looked away, shame coloring her features. "Because I believed him when he portrayed you as the villain in his story. I accepted his lies without question because they made it easier to justify my own choices." Her voice dropped. "And because once I saw the truth about what he'd done to you financially, I realized I wasn't his partner. I was just his next victim." "Explain." 3 months ago, Richard convinced me to invest my entire savings, plus a loan he helped me secure, into the West Coast Fund. He said it was a partner privilege with guaranteed returns. Her bitter laugh held no humor. "Turns? Out my $140,000 is as gone as your joint assets." The revelation shifted my perception of the young woman before me. Not just the other woman who had participated in destroying my marriage, but another financial casualty of Richard's expanding circle of deception. "There's something else," Vanessa continued, reaching back into her bag. "Something I think explains why everything accelerated so quickly." She placed a formal-looking letter on the table, Westbrook Investment Group letterhead, addressed to Richard, dated just 3 weeks before he had abandoned our marriage. This was with the other documents. "It's from Westbrook's compliance department." I scanned the letter quickly, its contents illuminating the timing of Richard's sudden departure. An internal audit had flagged unusual patterns in client fund allocations to West Coast property investments. The compliance officer had requested detailed documentation of due diligence processes and client authorization forms by the end of the month. Essentially, the proof Richard couldn't provide without exposing his scheme. He knew he was about to be caught, I concluded, the timeline finally making sense. So he accelerated his exit plan, abandoning our marriage, taking what assets he could liquidate, and setting up his new life with you in California while preparing for possible escape if necessary. Vanessa nodded, her expression hollow. I was never the reason. I was just convenient, a stepping stone. Young enough to be flattered by his attention, naive enough to believe his stories about his unhappy marriage, useful because my transfer to the California office gave him a plausible reason for frequent cross-country trips. The clinical detachment with which she assessed her own role suggested she had spent the weekend coming to terms with how thoroughly she had been manipulated, a process I recognized from my own rapid evolution over the past week. What do you want from me, Vanessa? I asked directly, gathering the documents she had provided. Nothing you can give me, she replied with unexpected dignity. My career at Westbrook is over. My savings are gone. My reputation in the industry is destroyed. She stood, straightening her shoulders with visible effort. I just thought you deserved to know the truth before I met with the FBI this morning, and I wanted to apologize, for whatever that's worth. As she turned to leave, professional strategy overtook personal reaction. Wait, I called after her. These documents, the client transfer lists, the compliance warning, the escape plan, they're critical evidence for the SEC investigation. Your cooperation could be significant for the clients who've lost investments. She paused, hand on the door. I'm turning everything over to the authorities today. I've already accepted that I'll likely face questions about my own involvement, even though I never knew the true nature of his activities. I could connect you with James Chen at the SEC, I offered, making a rapid calculation about mutual benefit. Having a representative who understands the full context might be advantageous for both the investigation and your position. Vanessa considered this, suspicion briefly crossing her features. Why would you help me at all? I'm not, I clarified. I'm helping Meridian's clients recover their investments by ensuring all evidence reaches the appropriate investigators in a coordinated manner. Your situation is incidental to that priority. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. You really are everything he said you weren't. Smart, strategic, and completely clear-eyed. No wonder he was intimidated by you. After she left, I immediately contacted James, briefing him on Richard's disappearance and the additional evidence Vanessa had provided. His response was immediate. The FBI would accompany SEC investigators to take her statement, and Interpol would be notified about Richard's potential flight. As I concluded the call, Charles appeared in the doorway, his expression conveying news. Before he spoke, the regional director position, he began without preamble. The board has made their decision. I straightened, mentally shifting from the Richard crisis back to my professional trajectory. I understand. When will they announce their selection? They already have. The executive committee held an emergency vote last night after your presentation. Charles extended his hand formally. Congratulations, Regional Director Hargrove. Your appointment is effective immediately. The professional validation landed differently than I had anticipated, not with triumphant elation, but with the steady satisfaction of appropriate recognition. This wasn't an emotional victory, it was the logical outcome of demonstrated capability. Thank you, I replied, accepting his handshake with appropriate professionalism. I appreciate the board's confidence. It's more than confidence, Charles clarified. It's recognition of exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances. Your handling of this crisis, maintaining analytical precision while navigating what must be personally difficult revelations, demonstrated exactly the leadership qualities Meridian needs. As Charles outlined the transition details, I realized that in just 7 days, every aspect of my life had been fundamentally transformed. My marriage ended, my financial situation overturned, my career accelerated, and now, most ironically, my professional advancement directly linked to exposing the financial scheme orchestrated by the husband who had consistently undermined my capabilities. Richard had disappeared with stolen funds and a false identity, likely fleeing to a country beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. Yet somehow, against all his calculations, I was the one emerging stronger from the wreckage he had created. 2 weeks into my role as regional director, I settled into the corner office that had once seemed an impossible aspiration. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered expansive views of the city skyline, the physical elevation a fitting parallel to my professional ascent. The office had been redecorated to my specifications. Gone were the heavy masculine furnishings of my predecessor, replaced with clean contemporary lines and subtle sophistication that reflected my own aesthetic rather than accommodating someone else's expectations. My assistant Malcolm knocked lightly before entering with the morning briefing folder, a ritual we had established to start each day with comprehensive awareness of market movements, client concerns, and team performance. Metrics. The Miller account quarterly review materials are ready for your approval, he noted, placing the folder on my desk. And the SEC has requested your availability for a follow-up meeting regarding the Westbrook investigation. Schedule the SEC for Thursday morning, I replied, scanning the performance indicators for our regional portfolios. And please inform the Miller team that I'll want to discuss their alternative investment strategy before the client presentation. Already noted. Malcolm's efficiency continued to impress me. A welcome change from the years I'd spent managing Richard's professional and personal details without acknowledgement. Also, Ms. Khan called. She says there are developments in your personal matters that require immediate attention. I looked up from the reports, instantly alert. Barbara never used phrases like immediate attention without significant cause. Get her on the line, please. As Malcolm withdrew to make the call, I turned to the window, gathering my thoughts. The investigation into Richard's financial scheme had expanded dramatically over the past 2 weeks. What had initially appeared to be a case of improper client fund management had evolved into evidence of a sophisticated fraud operation involving multiple Westbrook advisors and approximately $86 million in misappropriated investments. Throughout this period, Richard remained missing. The FBI had tracked his initial flight to Singapore but lost his trail during a layover in Kuala Lumpur. The Malaysian authorities were cooperating, but the working theory was that he had obtained false identification and potentially crossed into a neighboring country with less rigorous banking oversight. My desk phone lit up with Barbara's call. "Melissa," she began without preamble, "they've found Richard." I sat down, immediately calculating implications. Alive? Yes. Interpol located him attempting to open an account at a private bank in Jakarta using an altered passport. He's being detained pending extradition proceedings. The news landed with complex resonance. Not the emotional turbulence I might have expected weeks ago, but the measured assessment of significant new information. How does this affect our divorce proceedings? I asked, maintaining focus on practical implications. That's why I called immediately, Barbara replied, her tone indicating professional urgency. The federal prosecutors have frozen all of Richard's assets, including those you're claiming in the divorce settlement. They're moving to seize properties purchased with what they're classifying as proceeds of financial crimes. I processed this rapidly. Including our house. Yes. The federal case now intersects directly with our division of assets. We need to file an amended claim immediately asserting your status as an innocent spouse with legitimate claim to certain properties, particularly the house, and any investments you can demonstrate were funded from your income rather than Richard's. I'll come to your office this afternoon, I decided, already mentally cataloging the documentation I would need to compile. 2 o'clock? Perfect. Bring everything showing your financial contributions to joint assets. And Melissa. Barbara. Paused briefly. Richard's being charged with multiple federal crimes carrying potential sentences exceeding 20 years. This is no longer just about financial separation. After ending the call, I sat motionless at my desk, absorbing the implications. Richard hadn't just abandoned me with fraudulent debt. He had constructed an entire criminal enterprise that now threatened to entangle even legitimately acquired assets in legal seizure proceedings. My intercom buzzed with Malcolm's voice. The Miller team is assembled in the conference room whenever you're ready. I'll be there in 5 minutes, I responded, closing the morning reports and gathering the portfolio analysis I'd prepared specifically for this meeting. The ability to compartmentalize, to set aside the seismic personal developments involving Richard's capture and focus entirely on client portfolio strategy, was a skill I had honed over years of maintaining professional performance despite Richard's undermining comments and emotional manipulations. Now it served me in separating federal investigations and asset seizure concerns from the immediate priority of Meridian's largest regional client. In the conference room, 8 portfolio managers and analysts waited expectantly. Just 3 weeks earlier, I had been one of them, a capable mid-level professional whose opinions were valued but whose advancement had been deliberately constrained. Now I directed their strategy, approved their decisions, and held ultimate responsibility for their collective performance. "Good morning," I began, taking the seat at the head of the table. "I've reviewed the quarterly presentation for the Miller account, and while the performance recovery following the Westbrook situation is commendable, I see opportunities for further optimization." For the next hour, I guided them through specific portfolio adjustments, risk recalibrations, and strategic positioning for anticipated market shifts. The team's responsiveness reflected their growing confidence in my leadership, a trust earned through the crisis management that had elevated me to this position. As the meeting concluded, Charles appeared in the doorway, gesturing for me to join him. His expression suggested news beyond routine operational matters. "The FBI just called," he informed me once we were alone in the hallway. "They want to interview you about Richard's operation. Apparently, they've found documentation suggesting he may have attempted to manipulate Meridian's investment decisions through your position here." I absorbed this with a measured reaction. "That's impossible. Richard never had access to my client recommendations or investment decisions." I assured them of that. Charles nodded. "But they've recovered emails where Richard discussed with associates how your promotion might create opportunities for portfolio influence." The revelation shouldn't have shocked me, yet it carried a particular sting. The realization that even as Richard had dismissed my professional capabilities, he had calculated how my career advancement might serve his criminal enterprise. "When does the FBI want to meet?" I asked, already mentally cataloging all client interactions and investment decisions that might require documentation to demonstrate independence from Richard's influence. "Tomorrow morning. I've arranged for Meridian's counsel to be present." Charles studied me with concern. "This puts you in an extraordinarily difficult position, Melissa, both personally and professionally." "Not as difficult as you might think," I replied with unexpected certainty. "My investment recommendations have always been transparent, data-driven, and fully documented. Richard may have fantasized about leveraging my position, but the reality is that I maintained stringent professional boundaries between our careers, boundaries he repeatedly mocked as unnecessarily rigid." Charles nodded slowly. "Those boundaries may prove to be your most valuable professional asset now." Back in my office, I began assembling comprehensive documentation of every significant investment decision I'd made since joining Meridian. Client recommendations, portfolio allocations, risk assessments, all with detailed analytical justification. The irony wasn't lost on me that the meticulous record-keeping Richard had dismissed as excessive caution now formed my strongest defense against implications of his influence. By mid-afternoon, I had prepared both for my meeting with Barbara, regarding the asset seizure concerns and for the FBI interview about potential professional compromise. As I gathered materials for the Barbara meeting, my private cell phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Hargrove?" An unfamiliar voice inquired after I answered. "This is Warden Michaels from the Federal Detention Center. I'm calling regarding Richard Maxwell." My grip tightened on the phone. "Yes? Mr. Maxwell has requested that you be added to his approved visitor and call list. Before processing this request, we need verbal confirmation of your willingness to be included." The request was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't formulate a response. After everything, the abandonment, the debt, the discovered criminal enterprise, Richard wanted contact. "May I ask if Mr. Maxwell provided a reason for this request?" I finally managed, professional courtesy masking the complexity of my reaction. "He indicated you're his wife and therefore entitled to visitation privileges," the warden replied, his tone suggesting he was simply following procedural requirements. "I am his wife only in legal status pending divorce proceedings," I clarified. "We are separated, and I have no interest in being included on his visitor or call list." "Understood. I'll document your response accordingly." After ending the call, I remained at my desk, contemplating Richard's motivation. Was this a genuine attempt at reconciliation? More likely a calculated move to establish ongoing contact through which he might manipulate the divorce proceedings, or influence my potential testimony regarding his financial activities? Whatever his reasoning, the request represented Richard's fundamental misunderstanding of how completely our relationship had transformed. The woman who had accommodated his needs, managed his life, and accepted his diminishment no longer existed. In her place stood someone who recognized manipulation for what it was, and who now held professional authority Richard had never anticipated. My intercom buzzed. "Ms. Hargrove, there's a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but says it's regarding the Maxwell case." I took a deep breath, centering myself for whatever new complexity this might introduce. "Send her in, please." The woman who entered carried herself with the unmistakable authority of federal prosecution, tailored suit, minimal jewelry, and the focused intensity of someone whose professional currency was precision. "Ms. Hargrove, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Weathers," she introduced herself, extending a business card. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Of course," I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I assume this relates to the ongoing investigation of Richard Maxwell's financial activities." "Yes and no," she replied, setting her briefcase on her lap. "I'm here about a specific aspect of the case that directly impacts you. We've received indication that Richard Maxwell intends to claim that you were a knowing participant in his financial scheme." The accusation landed with cold clarity, not as an emotional blow, but as the logical next move in Richard's desperate attempt to distribute culpability. "On what possible basis?" I inquired, my tone reflecting professional interest rather than defensive reaction. "He's provided his attorney with emails and text messages he claims demonstrate your awareness of and participation in directing client funds to his California investments." Weathers watched me carefully, clearly assessing my reaction. I nodded, slowly analyzing rather than responding emotionally. A predictable strategy. When facing overwhelming evidence, create reasonable doubt by implicating others, particularly someone with financial expertise who could potentially share culpability. Weathers seemed momentarily surprised by my clinical assessment. Most spouses react more personally to such accusations. I stopped reacting personally to Richard's manipulations the day he abandoned me with $200,000 in fraudulent debt, I replied evenly. I now analyze his actions for what they are: strategic moves with predictable patterns. For the next 20 minutes, I outlined for Weathers the professionally segregated nature of our careers, the documented timeline of my investment decisions showing complete independence from Richard's schemes, and the pattern of his dismissive comments about my financial capabilities that contradicted any claim of my involvement in sophisticated fraud. "There's something else you should know," I added, retrieving a file from my credential. "I've maintained records of Richard's communications about my career, specifically his consistent efforts to discourage my advancement and his dismissive characterization of my financial expertise." I handed her several printed emails and text messages spanning years, messages where Richard had described my work as just pushing papers around, had advised me to leave the real financial strategy to those built for it, and had actively discouraged me from pursuing promotions that would unnecessarily complicate our lives with your increased responsibilities. Weathers reviewed them with growing interest. "These directly contradict his claim that he valued your financial acumen enough to involve you in his scheme." Exactly. Richard systematically undermined my professional advancement and repeatedly dismissed my financial capabilities, hardly the actions of someone who considered me a sophisticated co-conspirator. As our meeting concluded, Weathers stood to leave, her assessment of me visibly recalibrated. "Your analytical approach to this situation is unusual, Ms. Hargrove. Most witnesses in your position struggle to maintain such an objective perspective." "My analytical capabilities were precisely what Richard underestimated," I replied as I walked her to the door. "It's fitting that they now serve as my most effective defense against his accusations." After she departed, I stood at my office window, watching afternoon light cast long shadows across the city below. In just 3 weeks, I had navigated a professional crisis, personal betrayal, and now criminal accusations, all while establishing leadership of Meridian's regional operations and systematically rebuilding my financial independence. The irony was absolute. Richard's attempt to destroy me financially had instead catalyzed my professional resurgence. His effort to escape consequences had accelerated his capture. And now, his desperate attempt to implicate me would provide the very opportunity I had not dared hope for: the chance to confront him directly, not as his abandoned wife seeking emotional closure, but as a financial expert whose testimony could ensure his accountability. 1 month after Richard's arrest and extradition, I sat in a federal building conference room, waiting for the deposition that would bring us face to face for the first time since his disappearance. The U.S. Attorney's Office had requested my testimony to refute Richard's claims of my involvement in his scheme, a procedural necessity that carried personal significance beyond the legal implications. I had prepared meticulously, reviewing every document, email, and financial record that demonstrated my professional independence from Richard's activities. Barbara sat beside me, present not as my divorce attorney, but as personal counsel during federal proceedings. Across the table, Caroline Weathers organized her materials with the measured precision I had come to respect during our previous interactions. "He'll be brought in momentarily," Weathers informed us, checking her watch. "Just to reiterate, this is a deposition under oath, being recorded and transcribed. The purpose is to establish facts regarding your knowledge of and involvement in the investment activities under investigation." I nodded, maintaining the composed exterior that had become my professional signature while internally acknowledging the surreal nature of the situation. 61 days earlier, I had been making coffee in our kitchen, planning dinner for Richard's colleagues. Now I sat preparing to provide federal testimony that would likely contribute to his criminal conviction. The door opened and Richard entered, accompanied by a U.S. Marshal and his defense attorney, a sharp-featured man whose expensive suit and confident bearing suggested high-powered criminal defense expertise. But it was Richard who commanded my attention, the physical transformation in him startling despite my mental preparation. Gone was the polished finance executive with carefully maintained appearance and practiced confidence. The man who entered wore standard-issue detention center clothing, his hair no longer perfect, his posture diminished. Without access to his usual propecia, his hair had thinned noticeably at the crown, the vanity issue he had hidden throughout our marriage now visible for all to see. Most striking was his expression as he registered my presence, an initial flash of shock quickly masked by calculation. He hadn't expected to face me directly, I realized. Despite requesting to add me to his visitor list, he had anticipated dealing with me through attorneys and court filings, not across a conference table under oath. "Please state your name for the record," the court reporter requested as proceedings began. "Melissa Hargrove." I had legally restored my maiden name the previous week, another reclamation of identity that Richard was now confronted with directly. For the next hour, Weathers led me through structured questioning about my professional history, my role at Meridian, the nature of my marriage to Richard, and my knowledge of his investment activities. I responded with precise clarity, documenting the separation between our professional lives and the limited information Richard had shared about his California investments. Throughout my testimony, I maintained direct eye contact with Weathers, rather than Richard, though I remained acutely aware of his reactions, the slight shifts in posture, the occasional whispered conference with his attorney, the growing tension in his jaw as my testimony systematically dismantled his claims of my involvement. When Weathers concluded her questioning, Richard's attorney took over, his approach immediately more aggressive. "Ms. Hargrove, as a financial professional with advanced training, are you asking us to believe you had no knowledge of your husband's investment activities despite sharing a household for 15 years? "I'm not asking you to believe anything," I replied evenly. "I'm testifying under oath that Richard deliberately compartmentalized our finances, repeatedly discouraged my involvement in investment decisions, and systematically minimized my financial expertise throughout our marriage." The attorney shuffled through his notes, clearly searching for inconsistencies. "Yet you managed household finances, correct? You had access to bank statements, credit card bills, tax returns?" "I managed the specific accounts Richard designated for household expenses," I clarified. "He maintained separate accounts for investments and major assets, accounts to which I had no access and about which I received limited information. That arrangement didn't strike you as unusual? As a financial professional yourself?" I met his gaze directly. Richard framed it as an efficient division of responsibilities. When I expressed interest in our broader financial picture, he typically responded with comments like, "Don't worry your pretty head about complex investments," or "Stick to the household budget, honey. That's more your speed." For the first time, I allowed my glance to shift briefly to Richard, whose expression tightened. At hearing his own condescending phrases quoted back, "You expect us to believe that you, a Harvard-educated financial analyst, accepted such dismissive treatment of your expertise?" The attorney's tone suggested skepticism designed to undermine my credibility. "I didn't merely accept it," I corrected him. "I documented it, for years." I gestured toward the exhibit folder Weathers had prepared. Those exhibits include 15 years of emails, text messages, and witness statements in which Richard consistently undermined my financial capabilities, discouraged my professional advancement, and maintained rigid separation between his investment activities and my financial roles. Richard shifted uncomfortably, leaning toward his attorney for a hurried, whispered exchange. The pattern was familiar, Richard realizing he had miscalculated, attempting to adjust strategy mid-course. "Let's discuss your recent promotion at Meridian." His attorney pivoted, clearly abandoning the line of questioning that had backfired. "Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Just as investigations into your husband's activities intensified, you suddenly received a significant advancement." "There was nothing sudden about it," I replied. "My promotion resulted from demonstrating exceptional crisis management skills during Meridian's response to the very fraud scheme we're discussing today. A scheme that victimized our clients and that I helped expose through detailed forensic analysis." The questioning continued for another hour, becoming increasingly technical as Richard's attorney attempted to establish financial entanglements that might suggest my knowledge of or benefit from his criminal activities. Throughout, I maintained precise, documented responses that systematically dismantled each implication of involvement. When the formal deposition concluded, Richard's attorney requested a brief recess before the secondary statements Weathers had planned. As the room cleared, leaving only Richard, his attorney, Barbara, and me, Richard finally addressed me directly. Melissa. His voice carried that familiar tone, the one he had used when trying to manage difficult situations through charm and persuasion. This has all spiraled out of control. We need to talk privately. Find a reasonable resolution. I studied him with clinical detachment, noting the calculation behind his apparent reasonableness. Any communication should go through our respective attorneys, Richard. This isn't who we are, he persisted, leaning forward slightly. 15 years together, and now we're adversaries in a federal case? There are better solutions for both of us. What solution are you proposing? Barbara interjected professionally. My client has provided truthful testimony under oath about her non-involvement in your client's activities. Richard's attorney whispered something to him, but Richard shook his head slightly, determined to establish direct communication. Melissa, you know how these cases work. If we present a unified front, negotiate a reasonable settlement, we both benefit. Your career continues its upward trajectory. I accept responsibility for certain oversights. Everyone moves forward. The offer was classic Richard, vague promises of mutual benefit masking his desperate attempt to mitigate consequences. I almost admired the audacity of suggesting unified front weeks after attempting to implicate me in his crimes. Let me be perfectly clear, I replied, my voice even but firm. I have built a successful career despite your consistent undermining. I have reclaimed financial stability despite the fraudulent debt you left me. I have established professional credibility by helping Meridian protect clients from your investment scheme. I have no interest in, need for, or benefit from any unified front with you. Richard's practiced composure slipped momentarily, frustration breaking through. You've made your point, Melissa. The promotion, the name change, the tough professional stance. I get it. You're independent now. But pragmatically, working together through this situation benefits us both. No, Richard, I corrected him quietly. It benefits you. And for 15 years, I prioritized what benefited you over what was right for me. That pattern ended the day you left. His expression hardened, the charming facade dissolving entirely. You're making a mistake. Do you really want to see this through to the end? My attorney will be obligated to explore every aspect of our financial history, including questions about what you knew and when. No one comes through that kind of scrutiny unscathed. The implied threat confirmed everything about Richard's character that I had finally recognized. His reflexive manipulation, his assumption that others shared his ethical flexibility, his belief that intimidation could override principle. I've already been through that scrutiny, I replied calmly. The SEC, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and Meridian's Compliance Department have examined every financial decision I've made for the past decade. My professional record stands on its own merit. I gathered my portfolio, prepared to leave the room. You miscalculated, Richard. You assumed I would crumble when you left. You assumed I couldn't navigate the financial chaos you created. You assumed your accusations would intimidate me into compliance. You were wrong on every count. As I stood, Richard made one final attempt. Melissa, wait. There's something you don't know about the California properties. Ms. Hargrove has completed her required testimony, Barbara interrupted firmly. Any additional information your client wishes to provide should go through appropriate legal channels. Richard's attorney nodded in reluctant agreement, placing a restraining hand on Richard's arm. She's right, Richard. Not here, not now. As we left the conference room, I felt a profound shift. Not the emotional catharsis of confronting a former partner, but the professional satisfaction of having maintained precision and integrity during a critical testimony. The woman who had once measured her worth through Richard's approval had been replaced by someone who recognized her own value independently of external validation. In the elevator, Barbara gave me an appraising look. That was remarkable composure, especially during his direct appeals. It wasn't difficult, I replied with genuine realization. Richard's manipulative tactics only work when you still value his opinion or fear his disapproval. I no longer do either. Outside the federal building, autumn sunlight cast long shadows across the plaza as government employees and visitors moved purposefully between buildings. I paused, taking in the ordinary activity continuing around me despite the extraordinary transformation of my own circumstances. "What happens next?" I asked Barbara as we walked toward the parking structure. "The U.S. attorney will use your testimony to refute Richard's claims of your involvement. Based on the evidence presented today, they'll likely file additional charges related to witness tampering for his attempts to implicate you." She checked her watch. "And we have our court date for the divorce proceedings next week, where we'll address the asset division given the federal seizure auctions." I nodded, mentally cataloging the remaining steps toward complete legal and financial separation from Richard. The process that had once seemed overwhelmingly complex now appeared as a series of straightforward procedural requirements, each moving me closer to the fully independent life I was constructing. "He'll receive a significant sentence," Barbara added, her tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "The financial crimes alone carry potential penalties exceeding 20 years. And that's before considering the obstruction and witness tampering aspects. The information registered without emotional resonance, neither satisfaction nor sadness, just acknowledgement of consequences appropriate to actions." Richard had calculated and executed a sophisticated fraud scheme, abandoned his marriage with deliberate financial sabotage, and attempted to implicate me when caught. The resulting penalties weren't personal. They were systemic justice. "You know," Barbara observed as we reached our cars, "in 15 years of handling divorce cases, I've rarely seen someone navigate this kind of situation with such strategic clarity. Most clients in your position would be emotionally devastated, financially paralyzed, or both. I considered this assessment, recognizing its accuracy without false modesty. The capabilities Richard consistently dismissed were exactly what I needed to overcome the situation he created. There's a certain symmetry to that." As I drove back to Meridian, my phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. "Charles, checking on the deposition outcome." "It proceeded exactly as anticipated," I reported. "My testimony established a clear separation between my professional activities and Richard's scheme. The prosecutors have what they need to refute his claims of my involvement." "Excellent," Charles replied. "While you've been dealing with that, something interesting has developed here. The board received a communication from Westbrook's interim management team. They're exploring potential acquisition of certain Meridian client relationships to help stabilize their situation. I processed this with immediate strategic assessment. Which relationships specifically? That's the interesting part. They're interested in the regional accounts you now oversee, particularly the Miller portfolio. The implication was clear. Westbrook, attempting to rebuild after Richard's fraud scheme had decimated their reputation, was seeking to acquire the very client relationships I now directed at Meridian. "What's the board's position?" I asked, already calculating implications and potential responses. "They've asked for your analysis and recommendation before responding. Given your unique perspective on both Westbrook's internal practices and our regional client needs, they consider your assessment particularly valuable. The professional validation in this request, the board seeking my strategic guidance on a potential corporate transaction involving the very firm where Richard had operated, carried a certain perfect circularity. The financial expertise he had consistently minimized was now being sought at the highest levels to evaluate the firm he had damaged. I'll prepare a comprehensive analysis by tomorrow morning," I promised, already mentally outlining the approach I would take. "The board will appreciate that," Charles confirmed. "And Melissa, Regardless of your recommendation, this request demonstrates how significantly your professional standing has evolved. From analyst to strategic advisor to the board in less than 2 months is unprecedented at Meridian. As the call ended, I continued toward the office, the parallel tracks of my professional ascent and Richard's downfall now fully visible. He had abandoned me with fraudulent debt, assuming I would spend years struggling under its weight. Instead, I had leveraged the crisis into career advancement that now positioned me to make recommendations about the very firm he had once represented. The woman who had once been defined as Richard's wife was now Regional Director Hargrove, whose financial judgment was sought by Meridian's board for decisions affecting millions in client assets. The transformation wasn't merely personal, it was structural, professional, and increasingly public within the industry. Richard and I had both navigated with such different ethical frameworks. 3 months after Richard's arrest, I stood in Meridian's executive conference room presenting my final recommendation regarding Westbrook's acquisition proposal. The boardroom carried the hushed importance of significant corporate decisions. 12 board members seated around the polished mahogany table, executive leadership positioned strategically throughout the room, and me at the head, commanding attention with quiet authority that had become my professional signature. Based on comprehensive analysis of Westbrook's restructuring plan, client portfolio alignment, and risk assessment, I concluded, directing their attention to the final slide of my presentation. I recommend conditional approval of their acquisition offer with 3 specific modifications to protect Meridian's client interests and ensure appropriate valuation. For the next 30 minutes, board members asked increasingly technical questions about my analysis, probing my understanding of regulatory implications, transition logistics, and revenue projections. I addressed each with precise clarity, the depth of my financial expertise no longer hidden behind a supportive wife's modest demeanor, but displayed with professional confidence. When the questioning concluded, Gregory Walsh nodded with decision-maker's finality. Director Hargrove's analysis is exceptionally thorough. I move that we accept her recommendation and proceed with the modified acquisition terms. The board's unanimous approval represented more than a corporate transaction decision. It symbolized my complete professional establishment independent of Richard's shadow. The financial strategist he had consistently diminished was now guiding multi-million-dollar decisions at the very firm whose clients his scheme had victimized. As the board members dispersed, Charles remained behind, waiting until we were alone, before speaking. "There's something you should know before it becomes official," he said, his expression suggesting news beyond the acquisition decision. "Westbrook's board has approved their leadership restructuring plan. They're announcing a new CEO tomorrow morning." I nodded, having anticipated this development. Logical timing, announcing stable leadership just before pursuing client acquisitions. Have they selected an industry veteran to rebuild trust? Not exactly. Charles studied me with unusual intensity. They've selected someone with unique insight into both their internal vulnerabilities and their path forward. Someone whose handling of the recent crisis demonstrated exceptional financial leadership. Understanding dawned with startling clarity. "They've approached you for the position." "No, Melissa." His slight smile carried genuine appreciation. "They've approached you." The revelation landed with seismic impact despite my cultivated professional composure. "That's not possible. I've had no conversations with Westbrook's board." "They've been watching how you managed Meridian's response to the crisis," Charles explained. "Your forensic analysis of the fraud scheme, your strategic client protection measures, your testimony during the federal investigation, all while maintaining exceptional performance in your new role here. Their board chair contacted our CEO directly yesterday with their interest in recruiting you. I absorbed this information with analytical precision rather than emotional reaction, calculating implications and possibilities even as Charles continued. They're offering a comprehensive restructuring authority, CEO position with mandate to rebuild the firm's ethical framework, compliance systems, and client trust. He paused, allowing the significance to register fully. It's unprecedented. They're essentially asking you to transform the very firm where your ex-husband operated his scheme. Former firm, I corrected automatically, my mind already processing complex implications. Richard's criminal prosecution has been transferred to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Charles nodded acknowledgement. Which brings me to another development. The federal prosecutor called this morning. Richard has agreed to a plea arrangement, 15 years with possibility of parole after 10, full cooperation with ongoing investigations, and forfeiture of all assets connected to the scheme. The information registered as relevant data rather than emotional closure, another procedural development in the systematic unwinding of Richard's fraud and our marriage. Has he provided the information about hidden accounts they've been seeking? I asked, focusing on practical implications rather than personal impact. Yes, including offshore holdings in Malaysia that weren't previously identified. Charles studied me with evident curiosity. You don't seem surprised by his plea decision. It aligns with his pattern, I explained. Richard consistently chooses paths that minimize immediate discomfort, even at greater long-term cost. A trial would require public scrutiny he's psychologically unprepared to endure. Charles nodded slowly, his expression suggesting new understanding of both Richard's character and my analytical approach to even the most personal situations. There's something else, he added with careful neutrality. The plea arrangement includes specific stipulations regarding his sentencing location. He'll be assigned to the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury. The significance wasn't lost on me. Danbury was less than 30 miles from Meridian's headquarters. If I accepted Westbrook's CEO offer, I would be leading the company Richard had damaged while he served his sentence nearby. That seems unlikely to be coincidental, I observed. The prosecutor mentioned he specifically requested placement in a facility near Meridian, Charles confirmed. I believe his exact words were that he wants to maintain geographical connection to his previous professional community. The transparent manipulation was almost impressive in its audacity. Richard positioning himself to maintain psychological proximity to both me and the financial world he had exploited, calculating that geographical closeness might somehow preserve connection to his former life. What will you tell Westbrook's board? Charles asked, returning to the immediate professional decision before me. I moved to the boardroom windows, considering the complex intersection of personal history and professional opportunity. Leading Westbrook would mean entering the environment Richard had dominated, restructuring systems he had manipulated, rebuilding trust he had violated, all while he served his sentence within geographical proximity. I'll need to review their formal offer, I replied, professional consideration. Overtaking immediate reaction. The restructuring authority would need to be comprehensive, the compensation appropriately calibrated to the challenge, and the board fully committed to ethical transformation rather than mere reputation management. Charles smiled slightly at my methodical analysis of what many would process as an emotional decision. They're prepared to provide whatever authority and resources you require. Their board chair described you as uniquely qualified to rebuild what Maxwell destroyed. The phrasing carried unmistakable symbolism. Beyond corporate restructuring lay the parallel of personal rebuilding after Richard's destruction. The position would place me in direct authority over the firm where he had once operated with impunity, transforming the power dynamics he had so carefully constructed throughout our marriage. I'll speak with them, I decided, turning back to Charles. Regardless of my ultimate decision, the conversation itself represents valuable professional acknowledgement. The following morning, I sat in Meridian's executive conference room opposite Westbrook's board chair and transition committee. The formal offer they presented exceeded even my calculated expectations. CEO position with comprehensive restructuring authority, compensation package triple my current Meridian salary, and equity stake in the rebuilt firm tied to specific ethical compliance and client retention metrics. We recognize the unique nature of this opportunity given your personal history with Richard Maxwell," the board chair acknowledged directly. "That connection is precisely what makes you invaluable for our transformation. You understand both the technical vulnerabilities that enabled his scheme and the cultural failings that allowed it to flourish." I maintained professional neutrality, despite the striking irony of the situation. "I appreciate your candor. Before considering your offer, I need to understand the board's commitment to fundamental restructuring rather than cosmetic reputation management." For the next hour, I led them through increasingly detailed questioning about their willingness to implement comprehensive ethical frameworks, client protection measures, and compliance systems that would fundamentally transform Westbrook's operation. Their responses demonstrated genuine commitment to systemic change rather than mere damage control, creating the very financial environment Richard had systematically circumvented. As the meeting concluded, I made my decision with strategic clarity rather than emotional calculation. "I accept your offer, with one additional condition: complete authority to restructure the executive team without board interference." The condition was bold but necessary, establishing from the outset that my leadership would not be constrained by the same power dynamics that had enabled Richard's scheme. The board chair exchanged glances with the transition committee before nodding agreement. "Acceptable. When can you start?" "I'll require 1 month to ensure proper transition of my responsibilities at Meridian," I replied, already mentally mapping the complex shift from regional director to CEO. 3 days later, the announcement of my appointment as Westbrook's new CEO appeared in the Wall Street Journal with a headline that captured the extraordinary nature of the transition. From victim to visionary, Maxwell's ex-wife to lead firm he defrauded. The article detailed the unprecedented nature of my appointment, from discovering my husband's abandonment and fraudulent debt to leading the very firm where his scheme had operated. Industry analysts described it as poetic justice with practical purpose, noting that my unique position as both victim of and expert witness against Maxwell's fraud provided unparalleled insight for rebuilding the damaged firm. My phone buzzed. With a notification as I finished reading the article, a message from an institutional email address I didn't immediately recognize. federal.corrections, yesdoj.gov. The brief message contained a formal visitation request from inmate DAR247891, Richard Maxwell, scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon. I deleted it without response, turning instead to the transition plan I was developing for Meridian. Richard's attempt to establish contact represented his fundamental misunderstanding of our new reality. He remained focused on emotional manipulation and personal connection, while I had moved entirely into strategic leadership and professional transformation. The following week, as I prepared for my final presentations at Meridian, my assistant notified me of a visitor in reception, Vanessa Parker, requesting 5 minutes of my time. I hesitated briefly before agreeing, curious about her purpose after 3 months of no contact. Vanessa entered my office with visible nervousness, her appearance reflecting significant changes since our last meeting. Simpler clothing, less elaborate styling, the practiced polish of her former self replaced with more authentic presentation. "Thank you for seeing me," she began, declining my offer to sit. "I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to let you know I'm leaving the state, moving to Minneapolis to start over. The plea agreement requires my testimony but doesn't include charges against me." I nodded acknowledgement without unnecessary commentary, allowing her to continue. "I also wanted to tell you that Richard has been trying to contact me from detention," she added, her expression suggesting discomfort with this revelation. "He's sending messages through his attorney about maintaining unified perspective for the sentencing hearing." The manipulation pattern was so predictable it almost elicited professional admiration. Richard attempting to coordinate and control narratives even from detention. "Have you responded?" I asked, maintaining neutral professionalism. "No." Her answer carried unexpected firmness. "I've learned something about men who try to control the stories of women around them. She met my gaze directly. "I thought you should know he's still trying to manage perceptions from inside." I appreciated both the information and her direct delivery. "Thank you for telling me. It's useful context, though not surprising." Vanessa nodded slightly, turning to leave before pausing at the door. "I saw the announcement about you taking over Westbrook. It's—" She searched for the appropriate word. "Fitting." After she departed, I returned to reviewing the transition. Documents for my Meridian responsibilities, reflecting on the symmetry Vanessa had identified. Richard had operated his scheme within Westbrook's systems, using his position to manipulate financial structures for personal gain. Now I would lead that same firm, transforming those systems through the very financial expertise he had consistently dismissed. 1 month later, I stood in Westbrook's executive offices. The corner suite that had once represented the pinnacle of Richard's professional aspiration, now redesigned to reflect my leadership approach. Gone were the heavy masculine furnishings and ego-feeding award displays, replaced with clean contemporary lines that emphasize transparency and functional elegance. My first official act as CEO had been to establish a client restitution fund, allocating significant corporate resources to addressing the financial damage Richard's scheme had caused. My second had been to implement a comprehensive ethical compliance system that would have immediately flagged the very behaviors that had enabled his fraud. As I reviewed the organizational chart for Westbrook's restructured leadership team, my assistant announced an incoming call from Federal Correctional Institution Danbury, Richard's third attempt at contact since beginning his sentence. "Please decline the call," I instructed without hesitation, "and implement the communication protocol we discussed. No direct calls or messages from that facility are to be connected." 30 minutes later, I stood before Westbrook's assembled employees, nearly 200 financial professionals gathered in the main conference center for my first address as CEO. Their expressions ranged from skeptical to hopeful, understandable, reactions to both the damage Richard's actions had caused their firm and the unprecedented nature of my appointment to lead its transformation. "Many of you are wondering about the unusual circumstances that bring me before you today," I began, acknowledging the elephant in the room with direct professionalism. "Yes, I was married to Richard Maxwell. Yes, his actions caused significant damage to this firm's operations and reputation. And yes, that personal connection informs my understanding of both the vulnerabilities he exploited and the transformation required to address them." I moved away from the podium, choosing to address them directly rather than from behind a symbolic barrier. But that connection is historical context, not defining purpose. I'm here because I understand financial systems, ethical frameworks, and organizational transformation. I'm here because rebuilding trust requires both technical expertise and demonstrated integrity. I'm here because the very skills that were dismissed in my marriage are exactly what this firm needs for its rebuilding. As I outlined my vision for Westbrook's transformation, I was acutely aware of the perfect circularity of the situation. The financial capabilities Richard had consistently undermined were now being deployed to reconstruct what his fraud had damaged. The woman he had abandoned with crushing debt was now leading the very firm where he had built his fraudulent success. Richard had left me with $200,000 in debt, calculating that I would spend years struggling to overcome the financial devastation he had created. Instead, through a series of strategic decisions and leveraged expertise, I had emerged as his former firm's CEO, with authority to implement the very ethical systems that would have prevented his scheme. When I concluded my address, the assembled employees responded with something beyond mere professional acknowledgement. A recognition that leadership could emerge from unexpected sources, that expertise disguised by circumstance could reveal itself when constraints were removed, that transformation often required disruption to catalyze. Back in my office, I scheduled my first executive team meeting, establishing priorities for Westbrook's restructuring with the same methodical approach I had once applied to managing Richard's household while he built his career. The skills hadn't changed. only their application and recognition had transformed. My assistant appeared with a priority message, Barbara, with an update on the finalized divorce settlement. With Richard's guilty plea and asset forfeiture, the court had granted me complete release from all fraudulent debt, ownership of personal property not subject to federal seizure, and legal restoration of my financial independence. The formal notification marked the conclusion of Richard's calculated attempt to leave me financially devastated. Instead of the years of struggle he had anticipated, I had not only escaped the debt he created, but had leveraged the very crisis he initiated into unprecedented professional advancement. As I signed the final restructuring authorization for Westbrook's compliance systems, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation of the past 6 months, from discovering Richard's abandonment to becoming CEO of his former firm. The journey hadn't been one of emotional vengeance or reactive crisis management, but of strategic recalibration and professional assertion. Richard had calculated that I would crumble under the weight of his betrayal and the debt he left behind. His fundamental miscalculation wasn't just financial. It was his failure to recognize the capabilities he had consistently dismissed were precisely what would enable me to transcend the limitations he had imposed. The woman he had abandoned with crushing debt had become the authority restructuring his former firm. The financial expertise he had belittled was now being deployed to rebuild what his fraud had damaged. The wife whose capabilities he had consistently underestimated had become the CEO implementing systems that would have prevented his crimes. Richard had left me with $200,000 in debt for his mistress. A month later, I had become his new boss. Not through emotional reaction or vindictive pursuit, but through the strategic application of the very capabilities he had never truly valued. In the elegant symmetry of consequence meeting calculation, Richard now served his sentence in a facility 30 miles from the corner office where I led the transformation of the firm his fraud had damaged. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was it my focus. I had moved beyond reaction to Richard's actions and into creation of my own path, one defined not by what he had done to me, but by what I was capable of building for myself. The debt he had left to drown me had become the catalyst for my most significant professional ascent. The abandonment he had calculated would devastate me had instead liberated capabilities long constrained by our marriage. The woman he had dismissed as financially dependent had emerged as a CEO leading corporate transformation. Richard had left me with $200,000 in debt for his mistress. A month later, I became his new boss. And in that perfect inversion of his calculated outcome lay the most profound lesson. Our greatest strength often emerges precisely when someone underestimates what we're capable of becoming when finally unleashed from their limitations. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.